Well, welcome everybody to our program on addiction and recovery from the Sunshine Coast Health Center up here in Powell River, BC. And we've been talking about this idea of abstinence. And abstinence not as a treatment for an individual person, but abstinence as this general idea that this is the solution to any sort of drug problem. Okay. Prohibition would be an example of that. Just this general wide thing for this is what's going to solve society's problems with drugs. And so this idea of abstinence, which for a lot of people they just assume this is the best approach, but you start thinking about it, you wonder if that's actually true. One of the things that we now know from modern research is that the way we look at addiction and its treatment and prevention is linked directly to the way our society interprets, what an addiction is, what's the science behind it, and things along that nature. In other words, it's not so much really the science that's dictating a lot of these ideas, it's actually society and how society views, in this case, drug use. So, for example, one of the more interesting findings that we found is that different cultures, different societies interpret drug use differently. One of the most famous studies was done close to Yale University, and the reason for Yale was because that was where basically the first real scientific research was done in the field in addictions, with E.M. Jelinek running the Yale program there. But around Yale are different minorities. So, for example, there's Irish Americans living there, and there's another group of Italian Americans. So one of the research studies looked at the differences between the Irish Americans and the Italian Americans. And you probably know that statistically they both drink quite a bit. But it's interesting that the Italian Americans, when they run into a drinking problem, they don't say, stop drinking. Basically, they say, look, quit being a jerk and learn to drink civilly. That's the approach. The Irish, on the other hand, tend to say, to someone with a drinking problem, well, stop drinking. So they're preaching abstinence. But the interesting thing is the research discovered that the Irish Americans were 7 times more likely to become an alcoholic than the Italian Americans. So that's interesting, eh? In other words, the group that preached abstinence actually had a higher addiction rate to alcohol. And this finding has actually been shown in many, many countries. In fact, if you take them as groups, it seems like the nations or societies or groups that say abstinence is the solution, for some reason, seem to have a little higher addiction rate than the groups that don't say that. So that's really quite interesting when you think about it. But it's one example of maybe there's something about the way the different groups interpret what it means to have an addiction, which will dictate then how they think it should be solved. Anyway, that's just one study that was quite famous, just to give you this idea that maybe our idea of abstinence is linked more to how we as a society perceive the problem, as opposed to what it may actually be in reality. Anyway, that's it for this week, and we'll be back next time with another program on our topic of abstinence.